I'm so excited to announce that it is officially here. Real Food for Fertility, my brand new book that I co-authored with Lily Nichols. If you're ready to embark on the incredible journey of motherhood, there's no time like the present to prepare your body for the most vital role it will ever play, the creation of new life. In Real Food for Fertility, we explore the power of nutrition to optimize your fertility and ensure a healthy start for your future child. But this book isn't just about nutrition. We delve into topics like the menstrual cycle, fertility awareness, birth control, stress management, toxins, artificial reproductive technology, and the most common reproductive health challenges affecting your fertility. Let Real Food for Fertility be your roadmap and trusted companion as you take the first step toward building your family. In a world where more couples are facing fertility challenges, your nutrition and lifestyle choices can make all the difference. Head over to realfoodforfertility.com for additional details. You can grab a copy of our book on Amazon. We currently have our paperback and ebook versions, and of course, we will be working on our audiobook version in the near future, and we'll keep you posted as to when that is available. So again, realfoodforfertility.com, and let's go ahead and jump into today's episode. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 508. Today, I have some exciting news to share. Today is officially the release date of my new book, Real Food for Fertility. Real Food for Fertility is a culmination of nearly 3 years of researching, writing, editing, more researching, more writing, more editing with my friend and colleague, Lily Nichols, and we are just so thrilled to be able to share this book with everybody today. We have launched this book on Valentine's Day, which was Lily's idea, which I think is just so wonderfully fitting. Fertility, love, making babies, all the things in line with our official release date. Lily and I wanted to do something special for our fans, for our community. And so we decided to team up for today's episode where we tell all about what was happening behind the scenes, how this project came about, how we met and became friends, and also a little bit of behind the scenes on the research process and how we selected certain topics and how we structured the book, how we decided what to write. And we actually reached out to our audiences on social media, and we've incorporated some of the questions from you, from the audience. So I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. I think that it's really fun. Lily and I had a great time having this conversation. It was nice after all the hard work is done to sit back and chat about how everything came about. A nice trip down memory lane, if you will. And we also share, a little bit more information about the book and what you can expect from the book. And so because we have so much to say and we took so much time, and effort putting into creating this amazing resource for all of you, we decided to have 2 separate episodes. So today's episode is more of a behind the scenes tell all, which I think you'll really, really enjoy. And then on Friday, I'm releasing a second episode with Lily where we get into more of the specific nitty-gritty. So we chose to talk a little bit about protein, a little bit about PCOS specifically. We get into a really good conversation about nutrition and the nutritional approach that we take within Real Food for Fertility. And so we highlight some of the specifics for PCOS because it's a really good example of the importance of regulating blood sugar and the importance of deep nutrition and balancing macronutrients. But we also talk about how that applies across the board, regardless of whether or not a person has PCOS. So you can expect that for our episode on Friday, so in a couple of days. And in today's episode, we're going to go ahead and jump in and talk about some behind the scenes for the making of the book. So for those of you who don't know, I'll just quickly share a little bit about Lily. Lily Nichols is a registered dietitian nutritionist, certified diabetes educator, researcher, and author with a passion for evidence-based prenatal nutrition. Her work is known for being research-focused, thorough, and critical of outdated dietary guidelines. She is the founder of the Institute for Prenatal Nutrition, co-founder of the Women's Health Nutrition Academy, and the author of 3 books, Real Food for Pregnancy, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, and of course our new book, Real Food for Fertility. Lily's best-selling books have helped tens of thousands of mamas and babies, are used in university-level maternal nutrition and midwifery courses, and have even influenced prenatal nutrition policy internationally. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into today's episode featuring Lily and myself talking about our new book, Real Food for Fertility. All right. Well, I'm super excited to be here today with Lily Nichols. Lily and I have been friends for a long time. I think unbeknownst to many of our fans, we're discovering.
Yeah.
And we're here today. We thought it would be fun to do a tell all behind the scenes episode on our brand new book. And I'm publishing this episode on release day. So this is a really fun day for us. Been in the making for several years at this point. And so I'm really excited for today's episode. Welcome back to the show, Lily. This is probably your 7th appearance. I feel like I counted at one point. And so you are the guest that has been featured the most times on the show.
Yay! Which feels funny because we talk all the time. So I'm like, what am I doing on your podcast?
Yeah, what are we talking about today? Well, so we both posted in our respective social media channels a couple questions, or we posted an invitation to ask us questions, what people would want to know. So we're incorporating some of those questions along with some of, I suppose, our own thoughts, and then we're kind of winging it. So whatever comes out, which I think will make for a really, really fun episode. So I read your bio already. I think anyone who's listened to the podcast for a long time is familiar with her work. There's so much overlap in our audiences, but there are still, I found, people who are a little bit less familiar or who haven't had a chance to meet you yet. So I don't know, anything you'd like to share about yourself in a nutshell for anybody who has been living under a rock and isn't aware of all of your amazing work?
Sorry, I'm just laughing. That's like a really funny way to intro me. Yeah, so I mean, my work really centers around nutrition in the childbearing years. And I think to date, most people associate me with nutrition for pregnancy and gestational diabetes because those are the topics of my other 2 books. And yeah, I think my work sort of centers around looking at how our guidelines are set and why our nutrition guidelines are what they are, and where there are gaps in the research. Like, okay, these guidelines are like sometimes 20, 30 years old, or maybe like they've been so-called updated, but they haven't really changed much in the last couple decades. And yet here's all this data we have showing how we could improve pregnancy outcomes by implementing these things. So I've long wanted to write more about preconception nutrition, because the more you dive into pregnancy nutrition, there's a whole lot of challenges and complications that actually have their roots all the way back to preconception health. A big part of the reason that you and I decided to team up and write this new book together. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. I feel like that is the most incomplete introduction to myself I've ever given, but I'm assuming you've already read the bio, and probably many people tuning in are familiar with both of us at this point.
Well, I want to ask a couple other questions to tease out more, because we need to share more of the amazingness, of course. And it's been a while since you've been on the podcast. So share with us a little bit just about your previous 2 books, and particularly the impact that they've had even on international policy. I feel like that's something that maybe people don't know.
Yeah, so my first book, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, I wrote after being a clinician, but also in the public policy area with the state of California's diabetes and pregnancy program, to kind of outline what I have found worked better than the nutritional guidelines for managing the condition. And I wrote that book with no expectation that it would really do anything of importance other than just provide the data behind my recommendations and like help outcomes. I was getting really frustrated hearing from colleagues who kept recommending the same things and then having clients, quote unquote, fail diet therapy, or hearing from women themselves. I was in a lot of gestational diabetes Facebook groups at the time, and just the terrible advice they were given by their clinicians, which was making their condition worse and necessitating them to go on medication and insulin when they probably didn't really need it. They just needed to shift their diet and lifestyle in a different way than they had been advised. I mean, that's the whole reason that I wrote the book. But within about, it was within about a year of when it was released. And by the way, I didn't know what I was doing. I had no marketing plan. I didn't talk about the book before it was released at all. I just released it and announced it to my email list. You know what I mean? It was no launch, no marketing until after the fact. And it ended up in some Twitter thread. There was a guy in the Czech Republic who had a colleague who worked in the policy level for gestational diabetes, and she was what they call a diabetologist, or a diabetes specialist, as they call it over there. And she ended up with a copy of my book on her desk. And that is ultimately what influenced the shift in the Czech Republic, countrywide dietary guidelines for gestational diabetes. So originally they had you need to consume a minimum of 200 grams of carbohydrates per day if you have gestational diabetes, and they actually reversed it to the opposite. So it's now a maximum of 200 grams of carbohydrates per day. And they have since reported, and that was done in 2016, and they've reported, significant improvements in outcomes. So fewer babies who are born macrosomic or larger than expected, which can be a side effect of poorly controlled gestational diabetes, lower rates of neonatal hypoglycemia, 50% or more reduction in the needs for prescribing insulin or blood sugar lowering medication. And this mirrors exactly the kind of stats that we saw in practice, in California. So yeah, so that's really cool that had that impact, very unexpected. And then Real Food for Pregnancy came about because people started asking me, hey, I like your book on gestational diabetes, but do you have anything for general pregnancy? And I was like, just follow the gestational diabetes book. It's basically the same thing. You just don't have to be as obsessive about your blood sugar, but those same principles really apply to everybody. And finally, it hit critical mass after I had my first baby and had navigated the system, which is a mess, and was like, wow, there is really so much more that needs to be said than I said in Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. There's so many myths that are perpetuated. And it took me a lot of time to dive in, okay, they're telling me not to avoid these foods for food safety reasons. I'm I didn't really dive into that in the gestational diabetes book. I kept it really focused on blood sugar. And it's you know what, I need to go into that. So all the things that I had researched during my pregnancy, and then having gone through early postpartum, I was okay, we need to write a book. We're just going to be debunking all these myths. I have to put in a chapter on postpartum because I was 10 months postpartum when I started writing that book. And yeah, so here we are today, where I have long been oh, you want something for preconception? Just do the Real Food for Pregnancy advice. And then, of course, this snowballs into our book, which is 30% longer than Real Food for Pregnancy, covers so many different topics, so much different data. So, I can't say that I'll ever write another book, because we're at that stage where you don't ever want to write another book again.
It's a week after you give birth.
Asking, right? So we'll see where this ends up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I feel this ties us neatly into, I think, the question, one of the great questions that we got from our audiences, which is, how did we meet? Because it was somewhere between book 1 and book 2. So I don't know if you want to jump into that.
Yeah. So and please feel free to jump in with your thoughts too. So after I published Real Food for Gestational Diabetes with zero marketing plan, zero know-how of anything, I was you know what? I think a good way to market this book would be to go on podcasts. And this is 2015. So podcasts were not super popular.
Not like they are now.
Not like they are now. Now it's people will just be oh, don't you have a podcast? It's expected that you have a podcast if you have an online presence of any kind. And at that time, I think your podcast was the only one on fertility that I found.
There was like 3,
Okay.
like at the time, and so
Yeah.
few. It's absolutely wild now because there's hundreds, if not thousands
There's
now. But
so many
there
fertility
was
podcasts.
literally like 3.
Yeah, you were like the OG. So I was looking for podcasts that would make sense for me to pitch, and just looking through your episodes and listening to a couple episodes, I was like, oh, she's really good. I like this content. And I think like we could kind of tie this into, something that'd be useful to your audience. So I cold pitched you over email to see if you wanted to have me on your podcast. And you wanted to see my book first, which like at the time I had pitched some podcasts. I'm trying to remember where in the timeline this had gone, but like you asked for a copy of the book, a paperback copy of the book, and the only other person who had asked me to mail them a paperback copy of the book was Rob Wolf. Like Rob Wolf had me on his podcast, which was a really big deal at the time. Like that was a big name. He had some articles on gestational diabetes, and I was like, oh, this would be a really good fit. But it was only you two who had asked for a paperback copy, and you're in Canada, so I'm like, man, this is going to cost me like 30 or 40 bucks, and she still might say no and not have me on. But like, oh well, I'll mail it, cost of doing business. And yeah, I'm glad we did, because look at us now.
Well, yeah, I remember that. And it was very, very early on. So we'll link the episode to the show notes page. But if I remember correctly, it was somewhere like episode 15 or episode 20.
Oh,
You were
man.
one of my very first.
I'm so embarrassed to hear. I don't ever listen to my podcast episodes, like ever, but I would be extremely embarrassed to listen to that one. So have fun, guys.
Well, it's interesting. I thought that myself because, of course, I've been podcasting since 2014. And so that's a lot, like 10 years this year. So I went back a few years ago and actually listened to like episode 1 just out of curiosity, thinking it was just going to be awful. And I was like, oh man, I'm saying the same stuff that I was saying then. Like, I'm sure I wasn't as polished. Not that I'm polished now, to be honest, but I was saying the same things. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the episode is fire, because you had just recently written the book on gestational diabetes. You were on fire for the topic, just as you are now. And I would imagine that you're actually saying the same things.
I am definitely saying mostly the same things, just citing new data. Yeah.
Yeah. But I remember getting your book and like devouring it and loving it. I still have the same copy you sent me on my, like I'm looking at it. I still have it on my bookshelf. And yeah, so I was really excited to interview you, and I mean, the rest they say is history. I mean, it's interesting because then we've known each other for quite a while, and I had you on the podcast several times, so we were always really friendly. And I think there was that moment. So not a lot of people know that we actually wrote our books at the same time. So from what I remember, so tell me what you remember. I interviewed you, and I was trying to convince you to write Real Food for PCOS.
Oh, yeah, right.
I was like, you need to write the book on PCOS. And you were kind of like firmly like, no, I'm not doing that. But you were like, I think that it's time for me to write Real Food for Pregnancy. And I was like, well, I want to write a book about the menstrual cycle. And I had this great idea to write this book. And I think I jokingly, like in my mind, jokingly was like, well, we should just be book buddies and write our books at the same time. And I remember that you were kind of like, ha ha ha. But then, like, I swear it was like the next day you were like, okay, let's do it. And I was like, oh crap, we're writing a book.
Yeah, I think our interview was sometime in like maybe November. It was in the winter. And then I think we started writing and meeting weekly sometime early the next year. So yeah, so people don't know this, but we met almost every single week without fail for like
long time.
Definitely the full year, because I think it took me about 14 months or so from start to finish for Real Food for Pregnancy, which seems so short now. But we met every single week. I was writing Real Food for Pregnancy. You were writing The Fifth Vital Sign. Yeah, and we, reviewed each other's manuscripts, gave feedback on different sections. I mean, we were in terms of like what they'd call a developmental edit. We were very involved in each other's manuscripts. And just sharing interesting research that we'd find along the way, cheering each other on. You really do need accountability, because it's very easy to start a project and not finish unless you're like extremely motivated. So yeah.
And it took me about 2 years to write the book? Because you had just had your first son, I think, when you were writing Real Food for Pregnancy. Like you said, he was 10 months
Yeah.
old when you
He was
started.
10 months old and he was about 2 years old when I went to print.
And I had, see, my brain is all fuzzy on all the things, but I'm pretty sure that I had two. I had my eldest and I had my two sons already. And I
Yeah,
think,
you did.
yeah, yes, I definitely did. I'm like dialing back into the archives. Just picture that like that thing that shows up on your computer when it's slow. What's going on right now in my head? But I mean, it was something else, right? To juggle all the things at the time.
Yeah,
But we made it happen, and that consistent accountability and friendship really helped to just bring it all to life. So this was all going on behind the scenes, unbeknownst to anybody. I think it's wild how long we've known each other, and we've met in person once, which
I
will change
know.
sometime this year.
Yes, we have to get over to LA to record the audiobook at some point. People are already asking. And
Yes.
I'm like, we will, but we insist on reading it ourselves. I mean, I
Yeah.
hear feedback all the time. Like you recorded your own audiobook for the fifth vital sign. I recorded my own for Real Food for Pregnancy. And it's surprisingly hard to read what you write. I mean, I feel
Yeah.
like I was making mistakes every other sentence. I had an amazing friend who's a audio engineer, producer who
Who ended up also producing mine.
oh yeah, he ended up jumping in for
Yeah.
yours too. So he's amazing, so helpful at getting it all like edited and done. But it's so much reading your own work. But it also, I feel like it's so important that the author is reading it because you can actually give emphasis to the right things with your tone of voice, which some random person reading, first of all, they would probably mispronounce a whole bunch of words, you know? So yeah, you need the pronunciation on point, but it also makes a difference, I think, when the author is reading it. So we will do that.
Yes, it's
It will
coming.
happen. We
That's always
just,
the next question. When's the audiobook? Because the thing about
yeah,
it, obviously, as a podcaster, but also I'm an avid audiobook listener because I'm a busy mom with business and all the
right.
things. And so, honestly, if it wasn't for audiobooks, I would read significantly less. So I'm a big fan of audiobooks. And because I listen, I have a really high bar for what it needs to sound like. An audiobook is not a podcast. It's not the same thing.
No, not at
It
all.
requires a totally different level of, at least in my world, I'm sure there's some podcasters that have really high level quality audio, but I took it to a different level when I recorded the audiobook and also a different level of editing where we're removing breaths and stuff so that the audio sounds really, really crisp and clear. So
Yep.
we want it done right. We're going to make sure to get the book out. Getting the book out in of itself is an ordeal. The audiobook is its own thing. And
And
so,
audiobooks, because of the length of Real Food for Fertility, I mean, it's over 170,000 words.
yeah,
It is, as our editors have said, like this is 3 or 4 books
yeah,
worth of words. Like this is long, maybe even
yeah.
5 books worth. It's a long book. We're probably going to need to spend 2 whole weeks in
Possibly.
the studio
Unless we can
recording.
record at the same time. Like, unless we can, like, you can record
Yeah,
and I can record in different studios at the same
yeah,
time. But
correct.
I don't
Right.
even know if
Maybe
that's a
that's an
thing.
option, but yeah, it's going to be a lot.
Well, and we don't say this to like the feedback, I think, consistently that we've had is yes, it's a long book, but there's nothing in there that doesn't need to be. It's just a
Yeah,
big topic and we're combining. So I know for a lot of our listeners and all that, it's like we've heard it's like two worlds are colliding. I didn't
yeah,
even know you were friends. Like this is, but it really is. We're bringing in the nutritional piece, which is incredible. I mean, I think that's sufficient to say what you have put together for fertility has not been done, right? Like the level of research, but when we also then add in the fertility awareness piece, egg and sperm quality, we've had such positive feedback on just how the depth of work. So it is long, but not unnecessarily so. We pained ourselves to,
well, we were
cull.
cutthroat with the
Yes,
editing. We really were.
we were. So yeah. So okay, let's move on to some other questions. I feel like I've answered this other one. Whose idea was it to collaborate and write a book together? How did the project come about? I don't remember the moment
It
because
was kind
we've,
of both of us.
yeah,
We got together, what? early 2020 pre-COVID, and we were
Yeah.
like, yeah, we should write this book. And we're like, yeah, we're gonna get started. And then like COVID nonsense. And
Yeah.
then it took a little while to get like we were outlining things while navigating a world in chaos and like no childcare or like no school or
Yeah.
like all the craziness that was that. But I feel like it was sort of a mutual like, yeah, we should write this book together. And once we got a really solid outline together and could see how we would sort of parse out the writing of different topics and which chapters would be collaborative, like we kind of went from there. I mean, for both of us, it's not our first book, it's our third book. You also have a workbook that corresponds with the fifth vital sign. So it's our third book. We're not green to this process. So I feel like our outline was pretty solid. That said, outlines change, right? So we kept revisiting the outline and changing things around. Once you get into the weeds with something, you're like, well, do I need to talk about it here? Like, where's the main place I need to cover this topic in the book? Because of course there's overlap all over the place. And so we did revisit that, but yeah, I feel like it was sort of mutual that we're like, yeah, we are going to do this. Are we going to
Yeah.
do this? I think we're going to do
I
this.
know.
Are we
Are we
actually
really
going
going
to
to
do
do this?
this?
Are we really? Yeah. Well, and I mean, for me, from my perspective, for all of my clients who are listening to this episode, I recommend your book for all of the clients. And so, especially for my conception clients or my preconception clients, so those who are actively trying to conceive or planning to in the future. But then I have all these other clients who are actually not actively trying to conceive, but are just looking to support hormonal health. And, there might be even like quite a ways down in the future. But it's the same. It's similar to what you said about how when people were asking for the pregnancy book, you were like, okay, just read this book. It's like the same stuff.
Yeah.
That was how I was approaching it. Just like you said, it's like, well, this is really the foundational nutrition that you should be, the plan that you should be following if you're wanting to balance hormones. So it just felt like a
Yeah.
natural, a natural.
Totally. And I likewise, when anybody asked me about preconception, I'd be like, well, read Real Food for Pregnancy, but also get the fifth vital sign because you need to understand like what your cycle is telling you about your health. And you also need to understand like your fertile days so you know when to time sex for conception, right? Like you need both. So I think we are both recommending each other's resources as like a complementary pair. And you would think like, oh, well, then what's new in this new book? And then it's just there's so much that's new. There's so much
Yes.
new information in it. So many topics that were not covered. I mean, people don't know. I hope it's okay to share this. You wanted to write a whole book about sperm quality. And instead of having a whole
I
separate
have a
book,
cover.
the chapter, yeah, you even created a chapter. I remember this. That we have a very detailed chapter on sperm quality in Real Food for Fertility. I mean, so much so that I'm like, Lisa, we got to pare this down.
Yeah.
But you know what? The women are going to read it and then probably relay the key points or badger their partners to finally pick it up and read that chapter. They only have to read one chapter out of the book.
I know,
okay,
right?
like, come on. So
Yes.
you can do
It's
it.
a beefy one, but yes.
It's a beefy one.
Well, I think you touched on something because what's so I found the process. We've joked the whole time, like you're the only person I could write a book with. We're so well matched in terms of our obsession with research, taking it to levels that it doesn't need to go to this level. I don't know.
No, it definitely does not, but we did.
But we did. But I mean, there's areas where you would go, into the weeds about certain topics because you're on the nutrition side, getting these very detailed questions from clinicians about the controversial vegetarian chapter or the specific amino acids that are potentially, missing or conditionally essential in some situations and not others. So you're getting all of these questions that I am not getting. And so therefore you're going into a lot of research and depth that I wouldn't even think to in those areas. And I think similarly in some of my sections, when I'm like going into the weeds about like AMH or going into the weeds about the sperm quality, and it's kind of like the same idea. So I feel like by working together, we're able to go into those areas that we needed to, but also like pull back when it's like, do we really need like 6 studies in this one paragraph, Lisa? Like, do you really need
studies in one paragraph? 6 studies supporting one sentence? Come on.
Do you really need like all of those numbers? Like,
yes. I think what was good about having each other to kind of look over, we're neither of us are subject matter experts in the other person's subject, and so if we were reading a section of the other person's where we're like, wait, these statistics seem to be either confusing or overlapping or repetitive. Like, can we just focus on what point are you trying to make? I think we did a lot of that with each other's sections to really streamline the writing. It's so easy. Just both of our subject matters, it's very easy to get lost in the weeds and to lose the point. Like you really have to keep it quite focused. What's the takeaway that you want the reader to have? And I feel like it was good having another person's perspective to be like, I had all that extra stuff on CoQ10 that didn't need to be there. That was like high level, but I went down a rabbit hole. Sometimes you get sucked down a rabbit hole and then you're like, well, I have to write about this because this is interesting, but it loses the plot and it just confuses people. And so I think, kind of massaged each other's like sections that seemed to be missing the mark to bring it back to where it needed to be. And at the same time compromising, because that was, I think, another question people had asked, like, what did you do if you didn't agree on things? Like sometimes we just had to agree to disagree. And, that's part of the compromise of co-authorship is you're like, well, I wouldn't title that section that, or I wouldn't even include that section, or I would do XYZ differently. But it's like, you know what? That section's your responsibility. And like at the end of the day, it's probably fine. And really, at the end of the day, when we see the final printed book, we're like,
yeah,
it is fine. Like all the like back and forth about this titling this subheading or making this an H1 instead of an H2, like doesn't actually matter, but seems important when you're in the weeds, because book writing is just such a like detailed process,
Well, and I keep thinking of that phrase, like iron sharpens iron. And I really feel like that's true in this case, because I feel that the end result it's something that obviously neither of us could have done on our own, to the same degree, like, right? Because like you said, neither of us are the subject matter expert in the other one's field. So I'm super thrilled. It's been such an interesting process, and we're still friends. We are
still friends.
We made it through.
I think that speaks to our individual like nervous system regulation. I feel like even when we had disagreements, we were able to like solve it amicably. And also, more importantly, I say when one person is spinning out because something's going wrong, or like some contractor didn't do their job right and now we have to go fix it, which was a repetitive theme in this whole process, we could like talk each other off the ledge. And we did a lot of that.
It's like half the process was like talking each other off the ledge. I'm like, oh my gosh, this isn't working. And you're like, it's going to be okay. It's fine.
Exactly.
It
was quite the process. This was a long process. I mean, 3 years, that's obviously, that's more than twice as long, almost 3 times as long as it took me to write Real Food for Pregnancy. But also this book is so much longer and the editing process was so much more involved. And then the formatting process somehow was so much more involved. Every part of the process was unexpectedly more time consuming. And that is kind of a theme with book writing as a whole. Like it just takes a long time.
Yeah. Well, at this stage, we've sent out. So by the time, like I said, we're releasing this on release day. So of course, we'll share all the details about where to get the book in a minute. But so by this point, we've had some of the feedback from our advanced readers. And one of the kind of things that I've seen written a lot about it is just like, wow, like so much time and dedication that went into it. And it really did. I feel like this book was not just this thing that we were just trying to put out, or it wouldn't have taken us 3 years. It's very near and dear to both of our hearts. So I know for myself, I mean, this is the book I could have used when I was in my early 20s, not just to prepare me for pregnancy, because I was not ready for pregnancy in my early 20s, but to help me with just hormone balancing, having a deeper understanding. I mean, this book comes out of our obsessive need for research, but also I would say our personal experiences as mothers and women, our professional experiences with clients. We both have practitioner programs. So we're also working with practitioners who are also working with a lot of people. So the purpose of this book, at least from my perspective, is to really provide that resource that women deserve. And that's why, for me, that's why I'm so obsessive about the research. I really feel strongly that I don't want to be another person that's just, I have this credential, trust me because I said so, don't ask me any questions, right? I don't want to be that person. And in my work, that's the opposite of what I strive to do. I never want anyone just to believe something because I said so. And so with the book, it gives that opportunity for you to see our perspectives, but to see that they're informed by what the research has to say. And we're super critical about that. And this is what women deserve. And this is the only way that we're going to improve, whether it's birth outcomes, fertility, just the level at which women are informed about their bodies and their health. I mean, yeah. So anyone who reads the book can see that it's more than just this thing we did on a weekend, right?
Yeah, I don't think you throw together 2,600 plus in-text citations in a weekend. In fact, that was one of the questions that I got on my Instagram when I asked people was like, how many studies did you review? And like, how long did that take? Like, what did that process look like? And I mean, okay, when I say there's over 2,600 in-text citations, that means like
The
endnotes or
number.
footnotes, like the numbers, like at the end of a sentence where we're citing where that data came from. And oftentimes those numbers correspond to more than just a single study. Some of those are 2, 3, 4, 5, 10. We tried to cut down on the number that were like 10 or more, but it can refer to a lot of studies. Like sometimes we're referring to like a collective body of research by a single, endnote at the end of that sentence. And I mean, I would estimate, I had no idea it was that many numbers. We don't see that
Yeah.
until you compile the whole document, all the chapters all together. I thought it was going to be like maybe 1,500. So I was actually shocked when it was that many. And I would say we had to, at least collectively, have reviewed
Reduce.
over 10,000 studies. I mean, because
Yeah.
I feel like I sometimes would sort through 5 or 6 studies before I found one on a topic that was worth citing. I mean, there's a lot of studies that are poorly done that are
Yeah.
extremely biased. I mean, we did in fact cite some of those in places we're talking about research bias, like the bias against meat and fertility. There's a whole section on that in chapter 5. Please read. Because sometimes it needs to be actually called out, but it does take a lot of time. And there were times, depending on the topic that we're writing about, it's not like we sit down and like write a chapter and then like go back and stick in citations. Like the process of writing, sometimes you will spend days reading research before you write a single sentence.
Yeah.
And sometimes a paragraph will take you 20 hours between the research and the writing, massaging. Like people have no idea the amount of time it takes to put this together. Both of us launched our practitioner training programs in the midst of writing this book,
Yeah.
and the book was still in process. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like a book, my opinion, in this sort of like professional space, health space, writing a book is 1,000 times harder than putting together an online program or a course, even a practitioner program. When my practitioner program's all cited and sourced, just like yours is, like a research library and stuff, it's nothing compared to a book.
Yeah.
Because
Well, especially the
you
type
can't
of book
edit
that we're
after it's
trying to
done.
write. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you're putting it's different because you're putting something out there that's going to hopefully stand the test of time. And so, I mean, I was trying to estimate just how many hours do I think it took myself to write the book. I was kind of thinking, how many hours was I spending a week and, over the course of a couple of years. And I don't know the answer, but I would think at least 1,000 to 2,000 hours or something like that. I was trying to think of how many hours, but what you said about the process of writing, I think that that's a really interesting point for anyone who is interested in how we did it, because when I think about some of the sections that I was writing, before I write a word, I would go and pull a whole bunch of studies on that particular topic, read through them, review them. I have this intense, because I download all the studies and keep them in a folder. And so I have this ridiculous folder with, I don't even know how many studies are in there, 20, 30,000 at this point. I mean, who knows? And so I'm going through, highlighting, reading, making sure that this is what happens before often I'm writing. And so on a chapter per chapter basis, there's anywhere from, I mean, some of the chapters only have a few. We've got an introduction you were saying yesterday, you were like, why does our introduction have 4 citations? It's right. But our main chapters have anywhere from 50 to 250 citations apiece. So
Yeah,
this
some
is
might even have more. I'd have to look, but
yeah, and those are
yeah.
the numbers, not necessarily the total number of papers, because each number would have multiple. I was called out for that a lot. Our editor was like, "Why do you have so many citations? It's one little line of text. What is wrong with you?"
Yep.
Like, do you have the time? Like, put your feet up. I'll explain. But I was going to say something about this, and now, oh, this is. I just wanted to mention, for some of our readers, they might get their copy of the book and then think, wonder why. So we had to make a decision. We had to make an editorial decision because we had so many citations. So the book itself, I have the proof copy here, but the book itself is around 500 pages, all including all the things. So including the front matter, back matter, all the things. And so as we were writing and we were seeing how many citations, we had to make a call. When we prepared our PDF download, because that was the decision that we made, it's 200 pages. The
Actually, the
most
first
recent,
time our formatter formatted the references, it was 300 pages. I was like,
yeah,
whoa, reduce the font size and the
yeah,
line spacing. This is insane. But yeah, it's almost 200 pages, the
yeah,
final formatted references. So that would have made this book over 700 pages, which for printing costs is insane. But also, it's like, that's too much of a book to like
yeah.
carry around. You're not going to bring that on an airplane. It makes it ridiculous. So,
And like a fourth of it literally just being the citations. So,
right.
so we made that call. But I mean, we say this for a couple of reasons. I think one is so that you know what went into the book, and I think that's why we're doing the behind the scenes episode, because I know a lot of our fans, our clients, want to know this information. So a lot did go into it, but also so that you can know, when a lot of our advanced readers commented, especially our advanced readers who are also clinicians, that they're thrilled to have this now as a resource for clients, and having those references available really helps, because then for anything that you want to do further reading on, you are given the tools to do that. That's one of my pet peeves when
I
I'm
know.
reading books where the author says all these things and then I am a nerd, obviously, a data nerd, and I actually do want to read where you got that information and read more about that topic. And so I don't like it when there's no citation and you can't find out where that information
Yeah.
came from.
And so to clarify, while we don't have the full citation list in the book itself, we have a PDF download at realfoodforfertility.com where you can download the full reference list, the full 200-page
Yes.
PDF, so that if you do want to go look up any studies, you have all those references at hand.
And we chose to include highlighted references for each chapter, which I think was a really great idea. Lily, I think that was your idea. So that so we handpicked, actually, you handpicked, and then I reviewed, but we went through each chapter and handpicked an assortment of studies that give you kind of the broad overview of the chapter, the studies that we felt that stood out the most. So for those of you who just are, wanting that general information, we've guided you to that. But for those of you who want to go into the weeds with us, yeah, we have that option as well.
Yes, it is there for you, for all the research nerds.
Well, so to go back to some of the great questions from our audience, I mean, we've kind of covered this, but I'll combine some of these questions. But some of our audience were wanting to know where we start with research. Do you take what studies say and determine validity from what you know about general health? I think the question really is, how do you determine which studies are valid and which are not?
Yeah, I think so. You can speak to this however you want to answer, but I'd say for me, I think it's important as a writer, or I think maybe what sets both of us apart is that we're not just, well, we're not like truly academics, I would say. Like we're both research nerds, but we're not like in the academia silo where you only see research but you don't see clients. We're also not only clinicians who just practice whatever and then don't pay attention to the research. We kind of like bridge the gap a little bit. And so for me, like I've made observations over the years on certain things, and then I want to go check myself and see, is that actually accurate? Is this actually what larger bodies of data are finding, or was that just an N of 1 or N of 5 or N of 10 clients that had this experience? So we kind of like cross-check our clinical observations with the research. There are also times where if a topic isn't something we're super familiar with, I will do a search of terms and educate myself on a topic that I don't know super well. I would say like the fertility, what's really challenging about researching fertility, and I think why you have so many resources that are very bland in the information they give on fertility, or you also have people who just will be like, oh, well, we don't have research on that, is they didn't really do a thorough search of the literature. So if you're limiting your search on PubMed or Google Scholar, I personally prefer usually to use Google Scholar, but it depends. You get broader search results on Google Scholar and you get a narrower view on PubMed. So you kind of have to pick your poison depending on what you're looking for and what the topic is. But if I do a search on Google Scholar for fertility nutrition, you're not going to get all the research on fertility nutrition, right? Like you have to be really creative with your search terms. It's especially challenging because sometimes you want to look up something like egg quality, and then you're pulling up all these studies on animal nutrition, which we throw in some of those because sometimes that is the only data available. And we also have way more information on animal nutrition than we do human nutrition. But sometimes you have to put in terms that will like guide your search results a little better. Sometimes egg quality is referring to like a chicken's egg quality, like what is the nutritional profile of a chicken egg? Like the results can be non-specific. And that's what I found actually the most time consuming about the research process for this was you really did have to have like an array of possible search terms. And when you found a nugget, when you found a good study, refine your search terms from that. And that might open a whole other Pandora's box of research that none of your colleagues would ever find because they're not spending hours and hours in the research databases looking for literature. And then I will say on the like accuracy validity part, I think just this comes with experience, but with the more research you read, the more able you are to very quickly point out things that are inaccurate. And Lisa and I together with our own areas of expertise, she would maybe find something on nutrition and then run it by me. And then I'd be like, ooh, this is messed up because da 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 da. And I might find something with hormones. And Lisa's like, well, they didn't validate any of these menstrual cycle things, or by only validating this, but not this, we have no idea if this was going on. And therefore, like, we really have to take these results with a grain of salt. And so we were kind of honestly often collaborating on, hey, do you think this paper actually is like valid or worth writing about? Or if I write about it, do I have to give a contingency about XYZ? And that is something that I don't think it exists. Like, I don't think people realize like your level of research obsessiveness around hormones in the menstrual cycle is like beyond. Like, I wouldn't just write a book with any fertility awareness educator. There's all sorts of people who go through fertility awareness programs and all they know is whatever the program told them is true. And you are familiar with all of the fertility awareness methods, and you also validate what you've learned from those various methods with the research. And like that is something that is not typical at all in your field. And so I feel like both of us are just like, we are not the type of people who take a paper and we're like, oh, this is the truth. Oh,
Yes.
like we're really, really critical about the information we come across. And then we like would help each other validate stuff.
Popping into today's episode with an incredible resource to share. Today's episode is brought to you by my top resource for women's health professionals, How to Interpret Virtually Any Chart Your Client Throws at You. Our new ebook breaks down complex chart interpretation into an easy step-by-step process. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/chart to snag your complimentary copy today. That's fertilityfriday.com/chart. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. Well, I think that's you made so many good points that I want to tag on. One of which is when you said just reading a lot of research papers, because you do start to see that there are certain, I don't want to use the word consensus, because I feel like that word is a little bit loaded, but you see certain trends in research. So the more papers you read. So I think the interesting thing about, I think, both of our approach is that it's not like we're just trying to find a citation. So we're not just like reading one paper on the topic and then saying, this is the be all and end all, just like you said. You're kind of trying to understand the area of research and what the researchers are saying about it. Because within almost any area, there are some papers that are supportive to the conclusion and others that are not. And so then you have to start asking the question of, well, you have all these papers that are saying vitamin D is really helpful for this, but then you have these other papers that say that it didn't really outdo the placebo. Why? And that's when you have to kind of read enough papers. And I also think that the approach that we take, because there's research isn't just finding a paper that supports what you think. Research is actually trying to figure out what's going on in the field, what's happening. And so from that perspective, I never elevate one paper to be the be all and end all, because I think it's an interesting time that we live in where we actually, for better or for worse, need and want to have that research to validate the claims. Because when you're looking at these papers, they're written by people that come with their own biases. And you have to read a lot of research papers, I think, to start to see those things. And so what I mean by that is that we've talked about this a bit. I think this is actually a good, maybe we can give some of my favorite examples or your favorite examples.
Yeah, for sure.
But my goodness, like you're reading these papers, and because there's this kind of, let's say, consensus on the Mediterranean diet, which is why you wrote a whole section on it, then anything that they find that somehow challenges that their opinion on what is good in the diet, they just kind of ignore and it falls to the wayside. So I was messaging Lily a whole bunch this one day when I found this paper, because I do read lots of different kinds of research papers, but obviously I tend to read more about the hormones and the menstrual cycle. So I was diving in a little bit more to some of the food studies, particularly in this. I was looking at studies in this when I was writing the sperm chapter, the sperm quality chapter. And there was this one paper, and I wish I had it in front of me, because the title of it was mostly related to how the typical kind of Mediterranean diet stuff is good for sperm, right? Like the vegetables and like the fish and stuff like that. And there was no mention anywhere in the abstract about organ meats or whatever. And so, I read the abstract. I'm like, this looks interesting. Grab the full text. I'm reading the paper. And I find in the middle of the paper that the men who consumed organ meats, particularly liver, had significantly higher sperm parameters. And I feel like this is like a huge finding. You know what I mean? Like it's like it was right up there with the other stuff that they were talking about being beneficial, yet it made its nowhere did you see that in the abstract. So this is just to give a concrete example of how, if all you do is read the abstracts and you don't actually read the whole paper and go through everything and then see what they actually report in their results and how it compares to what they said in their conclusion, you would be amazed at how often it doesn't match and how often they're being very selective of what type of conclusion they're going to publish in the abstract, even though they found completely different results.
Absolutely. And I found the same thing. I remember us talking back and forth about that study. And I mean, their finding makes perfect sense when you understand the research, particularly around vitamin A in the active form of retinol and how that impacts the production of testosterone and production of sperm. And so it's like, like this actually makes sense, but they don't highlight it. Gosh, I found so many examples where I was just really frustrated in the research. I think as a whole, some of the studies that are looking broadly at diet that try to paint, they have an external concept of what a healthy diet is, and then they assign a score of how healthy or unhealthy the diet is and try to like compare that to fertility or ovulatory function or time to conception, whatever their endpoint was. Those studies are really frustrating to me because oftentimes they would put in the assumptions made around diet was that, of course, we have like things that are known to be harmful to fertility, like sugar, refined carbohydrates, trans fats, alcohol. They would put those in the bad category. You would have points deducted from your healthy diet score if you consumed more of those. And then fruits and vegetables, of course, and whole grains, of course, and legumes, of course. Fish, usually, of course, in the good category. But then meat, particularly red meat, usually went in the bad category, right? They're taking points away if you consume more red meat. So those studies, I feel like, have all sorts of, they're a mixed bag. And yet sometimes when you look more specifically at the women with the greatest, best ovulatory function, or the shortest time to pregnancy, they conceived quickly, those were often in the women consuming the most protein, including the most animal protein. But they found creative ways around not stating that in the discussion or the conclusion, for example. There was another one that I want to highlight. It was a study titled "Low Intake of Vegetable Protein is Associated with Altered Ovulatory Function Among Healthy Women of Reproductive Age." And if you just read the abstract, you would think, okay, women who eat a low amount of vegetable protein have messed up ovulatory function, so we need more. But if you eat less animal protein, you're good. That's going to improve your ovulatory function. But when you looked more closely at the data itself, animal protein had no negative impact on reproductive hormone levels. And it was not associated with ovulatory problems, despite how they wrote about it in the abstract. And more so, when you went into the data tables where they're giving the odds ratios for like how likely consumption of this type of protein food is to cause ovulatory issues, or is to be associated, I should say, with ovulatory issues, the study as a whole was purporting that plant protein was protective of ovulatory function. And legumes, like beans and lentils, those were associated with better ovulatory function. That's great. But when you looked at the categories for nuts and seeds or meat alternatives, those were associated with a greater risk of ovulatory issues. Yet the title of the study as a whole was like building up plant protein as the solution to ovulatory issues and bashing meat. When you looked closely at the meat, red meat, no association with ovulatory function at all, neither protective or harmful per this study's data point. And even processed meat, of all things, processed meat, which I feel like in the research is usually like a big no-no, that was actually protective. That was supportive of ovulatory function. And they just didn't even want to mention it. They didn't mention it at all. It was just glossed over. And here's our study. So it could have been titled something like "High intake of meat alternatives and nuts and seeds are associated with altered ovulatory function, while processed meat and legume intake are protective against ovulatory dysfunction." But they didn't title the study that. So,
well, I feel like all this is to say that our approach to research is not just to take the concept of research or any individual paper to be the be all and end all. It's really a process of delving through information and reading enough of it to get a handle on what it really says, what's really out there, what the trends are, what similarities there are between papers. And so this was hard to convey, I suppose, in editing, why I have so many citations for one line sometimes. But that's how it goes when you're looking to really interpret, because at the end of the day, it's not about proving ourselves right or whatever. Lily, you had also touched on how we often see trends with clients and in clinical practice, and then are wanting to see what the research has to say about it. And that has been one of the most fascinating aspects of this process, where you do see these trends and then you're able to kind of find out the reason why. Because often you're seeing, especially for me looking at the menstrual cycle, you're seeing the impact on the menstrual cycle. And then you want to dig deeper to find out, well, what is the reason, what is the hormonal basis for this, and et cetera, et cetera. So a couple more questions. I feel like we could talk all day, but I want to, for anyone listening, you've probably gathered, we didn't talk a ton about the specifics of the book. So that's why we're going to do a part 2. So I think this is going to be really fun for everybody. There were a couple questions that I thought were really interesting to kind of wrap up our discussion on the research aspect, which is super fun. So Lily, I'll let you take this one. Was there something you felt in your gut but found tough to back up with research? What an interesting question.
I guess I guess the one that, there are some topics that just aren't researched enough. Like we don't have the data yet. So I would say, and you'll probably agree with this, we need a lot more research on iodine and fertility.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of like associations with low iodine intake or low iodine status and delays to conception or greater likelihood of having ovulatory issues such as PCOS. But correct me if I'm wrong, Lisa, I don't think there's an intervention study on iodine supplementation in women with PCOS, right?
No, I have not seen one specifically. It's mostly either whether it's case study data or research that has been collected by practitioners, but not necessarily published in major
Yeah,
journals.
yeah. So that is one area where we would have loved to really, we can advocate that if you have PCOS that you, and a variety of other issues, that you explore having your iodine status measured, and that can guide you to whether supplementation is helpful or not. But as a whole, like the presence of any sort of like cystic tissue of any kind, like fibrocystic breasts, for example, we actually do have research on fibrocystic breasts and intervention with iodine treatment. But that is an area where I wish we had more data on. So we're careful with our wording on things to not overstate things that don't exist. But there is certainly from our practices, you do often see that women with PCOS are pretty iodine deficient. Actually, many people are iodine deficient.
Yeah,
And it's
across the
kind
board.
of, it's an area of research that I think has been controversial for a variety of reasons, whether justified or not. But that's an area for sure where I'm like, I have a gut feeling that across the board supplementation with iodine, not necessarily at ridiculously high levels, but like repleting people's iodine stores, I think would do a lot for improving PCOS. But I don't have an intervention study to say so. So we're, careful with our wording on that. And maybe one of those studies will come out
Well,
someday.
and what just came to mind as well is that although we don't have like what we need are the human studies, there's a lot of
Right.
animal studies. So that's one of those areas that's super frustrating because there are actually these studies, many of them where you'll have cattle who are not ovulating. So I don't know that we would say it's PCOS in a cow, but like it's a
Right.
very similar situation. They call it an anestrus, where they're not reaching ovulation. So that's a problem because the dairy industry is a moneymaker. And if the cows are not ovulating and lactating and then they're not able to get pregnant so they can have the milk and all that stuff, then it's a problem. And yeah, there's so many of these animal studies where it's not only iodine, but however, the iodine studies with the cattle show that it promotes ovulation. And I find, just as a side note, I find these like animal studies so interesting because there's these detailed lists of nutrients that the cattle need in order to have optimal fertility, with the same ones we talk
Oh,
about,
it is so
selenium,
dialed
zinc,
in with the animal
and like
nutrition.
they're just so specific on it,
Yeah.
and there's not a question. They're just like, this is
Yep.
what the animals need to be fertile. This is what, and the iodine is part of the conversation, right? But it's not
Yep.
like the whole thing. And I find it to be so interesting because I'm like, if we can get this dialed in on the cattle, like what?
No, it's true. I mean, I'm even like thinking about, we have backyard chickens. It's like the chicken food is all very carefully fortified with like precise ratios of nutrients and precise ratios of protein, for example, where there's like different chicken feed when they're babies and there's different chicken feed when they're laying eggs and there's different chicken feed for the birds that are raised for meat, right? So they have it all super dialed in because there's, an industry and money to be made, but there's also not ethics around interventions where you deprive nutrient levels, which we used to do those a long time ago. And yeah, you can't do that anymore, right? Yeah, it's an area of research where we just are really limited.
Well, last question on this topic, because I also think this question is fun. And I'll have to think about if there's any answers to me. But the question is, were there any new studies that shocked you?
New studies that shocked me. I guess I would say, I don't know how like new the studies are or anything, but I would say I found it very enlightening, the research on hypothalamic amenorrhea and looking at what these women typically eat. So just to give like a quick overview of that condition, this is when you're like no longer ovulating, or technically we talk about it being on a spectrum. Menstrual cycle starts to be disrupted, which eventually leads to anovulation and loss of the menstrual cycle. And it is often due to really not consuming enough energy to offset how much energy you're putting out. So it's either under eating, over exercising, usually a combination, and sometimes stress, or a combination of all three. And the conventional approach, I feel like, to HA is just calories, like just get enough energy. Like that's the end all be all. There's also some stuff floating around suggesting like a minimum carbohydrate level, and really kind of calling out that it's under eating carbohydrates, which it genuinely could be in some instances. But as a whole, when you look at the studies where they've actually assessed their dietary intake, I mean, oftentimes these women, not always, but they have an eating disorder or some form of disordered eating. And many times they're specifically limiting their fat and their animal product consumption as much as possible. And so carbohydrates, even though they're way under eating on calories, carbohydrates actually make up the majority of their diet, because protein's bad, it's from animals, and fat is bad because fat has calories, or whatever the rationale is. And so they're eating mostly carbs, like 60, 70% carbs, and very little of everything else. And I found this to be, I don't know, just interesting, because in practice, I find that increasing protein intake and fat intake, and particularly both of those from animal foods, does wonders for like restoring the menstrual cycle, or improving ovulatory function, improving blood sugar and insulin levels, and that sort of regulation, like getting your hunger and fullness cues like back in a healthy place. And I found it interesting that for a condition that we usually just think is, oh, well, this is lack of energy as a whole, I actually think it's often, I think it's lack of like energy from all macros. I'm not pro limiting any of them for this particular cohort, but I think specifically focusing on protein and fat and making them feel okay with eating meat can go a really long way to restoring the cycle. And then plus, since many of them are also athletes, their protein needs are even higher than like an average person anyways. So yeah, I found that, I don't know that the research was really new, but it challenged my everything that I had been told about nutrition for HA.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about that example, which is a great one, is that it confirms what I see when I'm working with clients who are in this area. What I see is just, whether it's intentional or not, under eating protein, definitely,
Mm-hmm.
eliminating fat for women in that category. So yeah, I mean, I don't remember if there was a question, actually. I'm still going on with the questions. What was the favorite part of the book? I mean, there's so many aspects of the book that, like, it's hard to pick a favorite. It's like, choose your favorite child, right? Don't have one, but love them all. But I definitely we worked so collaboratively on the HA chapter and the PCOS chapter. So those chapters were primarily my responsibility. And then obviously you nailed the nutrition section in PCOS. It's incredible. And then we worked so collaboratively with that aspect of the HA section. And I feel that that's one of my favorite chapters. They're all my favorite, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, those chapters really, I feel like we really, and again, it's because we're both clinicians, we can get in the like mind space of that type of client and write to them. Like originally, I think in one of our outlines, we had HA and PCOS like combined in one chapter. And then we're like, we're writing to two different women. We really need to have these chapters separate. And I'm glad we did. I think we really get into sort of like the psychology of it. The HA chapter has a lot, I would say, like a lot of hand holding, because it's really, it's so challenging to really nail down the importance of consuming enough energy and really being honest with yourself about, are you really adequately fueling, or like the exercise component? Are you actually like a compulsive exerciser? There's a lot of people where they just go way, 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 way over the top with exercise. Those chapters are awesome. I guess for me, I mean, I really took the lead on the first big chunk of the book, which is just heavily all the nutrition stuff. So what, like 1 through 5 or 2 through 5. And I love all those chapters. I would say the vegetarian chapter, though, I mean, when we were, so if we go all the way back to when we were book writing buddies and I was writing Real Food for Pregnancy, like I find that each book I get more and more detailed and more willing to say what I actually mean clearly, not like beat around the bush and try not to offend people. Some of this I think also just comes with age. You just care less about being canceled. So it's like, well, if you're going to say something of value, you're going to piss people off. So in Real Food for Pregnancy, I remember discussing it with you. I have a chapter on foods to emphasize, and I get all these questions about a vegetarian diet in pregnancy. So I decided to have sort of an addendum to the chapter on the challenges of a vegetarian diet in pregnancy, going through like the most crucial micronutrients and like what you need to look for and tips to optimize. But it's like stuck at the end of a chapter, right? I'm not trying to really call that out as the main thing. It's wildly in opposition to the pregnancy guidelines, which say a vegetarian or vegan diet is fine at any life stage with proper planning and supplementation, right? I have a different opinion. And so I'm presenting that with the facts. And then in this book, it was like, okay, I think you were like, this needs to be its own chapter. And I'm like, okay, like I feel for sometimes I want to like focus on the positive, like let me focus on the things to emphasize. And I try to do that in a lot of my content. Like I don't have really lengthy content on like, this thing is terrible and it's going to kill you. I have a lot of content on this is really good for you and consume more of it. And then as a side effect of that, you're going to be consuming less of these other things that I don't even need to name, right? But it does need to be said, and it does need to be said on the vegetarian component, because I think since the release of Real Food for Pregnancy, I have literally every single week I get feedback, whether it's from like direct messages on social media or emails to my inbox or comments on my article on a vegetarian diet and pregnancy, with just absolutely astounding firsthand stories of how this person was long-term vegetarian or vegan, and they had no idea that of all these potential deficiencies or all these things that were off. And like, it took them a while, but they decided to reintroduce things. Everybody does it differently. And then like, wow, I had this amazing result. Like maybe they struggled to get pregnant a second time. Like they were okay being vegetarian the first pregnancy. And then like their cycle was a hot mess when it came back postpartum and they couldn't get pregnant, or maybe like recurrent miscarriages or whatever it is, and how things improved so much when they included animal foods. And I mean, I knew the data on the micronutrients. Of course, I wanted to see how those came into play in fertility specifically, because it is, of course, all different. Even if there's overlap on the general concepts, the research is all different that we're talking about. But once I really started to dive in on that topic, I mean, that chapter is far more than just micronutrients. I'm really getting more specific on the macronutrient ratios and how those are off. I mean, you get the macronutrient ratios off, and it's associated with ovulatory problems. You got too many carbs, too little protein, and too much omega-6 fatty acids. You're setting yourself up for ovulatory problems. And that scenario is almost impossible to avoid on a vegetarian diet. Learning about all these individual amino acids and how they affect ovulation, early pregnancy, embryonic development, I was like, that needs to be said. I mean, there was just so many areas to go into in that chapter that I think that one, if there's ever a resource that is giving you a point-by-point, non-emotional, purely from a data standpoint, where there are holes in that sort of dietary approach and how it specifically how it impacts fertility, like this is definitely the one. I go into all of it. So I feel like that in itself could be its own book. Honestly, it won't be. It'll only be in Real Food for Fertility.
You're not gonna write a whole
I'm not
book on
writing
that?
another book. And I know I had actually some people I think had written in like, aren't you worried about like the flack you'll get? I'm like, I actually receive very little flack on my writing about vegetarian diets, because I think I do it from a place of writing specifically from the data points. Some people like, I'm not here to really like change minds. I'm here to present data. And so there will always be people who choose to eat whatever way they're going to eat. And we're actually not even entirely anti those diets in that section. We don't tell everybody to stop being vegetarian. We make them aware of some of the areas that you may need to supplement and improve dietary balance and like refine your diet, and then how to do so, the specifics on like how to reintroduce animal foods if you want to. I think that is something I've not seen in any other resource. And that is a question. I mean, that section is in there because that's the question that I get from people. I read Real Food for Pregnancy. I want to include animal foods again. How do I do it? Where do I start? And so we have a whole section that walks you through like all the different ways that you can think about it and do it, because there really isn't a right or wrong way, but like nobody has written it out with like a step-by-step of like what considerations are important to you, because everybody's, people choose vegetarianism or veganism for like all sorts of different reasons, right? So that's my very long answer to why that chapter was just like, that was such a labor of love. It's, yes, going to get a ton of criticism. I'm okay with that. I expect it, but I think it's going to be a really valuable resource for the people who need it. And so it needed to be written.
Well, and what I love I love that you wrote the whole chapter on it. But what I love about it is that, again, from like when clinical observations, I've observed, and it's controversial. If I'm going to get bad feedback on a podcast, it's always going to be on a podcast that addresses this question. Because what I've seen is that when I have the client who is not consuming any animal products or very little, it's very difficult, like you said, to meet that macro ratio to get enough protein and fat. And that plays out hormonally. So it's very difficult to have optimal hormone balance when you're consuming that way. And it's not my opinion. We're looking at the cycle and we're seeing those cycle issues. And I've spoken to many clinicians in different areas who've seen a similar kind of thing where you have a client, they have these goals to meet balanced hormones, et cetera, but they have a limit in terms of what they can consume, especially if they're vegan, but if they're limited in terms of their animal protein intake. And even if they do to the best of their ability within their dietary constraints, plus adding in a bunch of supplements, for many clients, there's kind of a limit to the success that they'll achieve in terms of the balanced hormones. And then what I've observed is that for those, women who then choose to incorporate some animal foods, often that helps them to like bridge that gap and actually get the results they're looking for. Whereas the ones who are not able to do that are often left in a bit of a stalemate. I feel like your chapter going into a lot of those holes that have not really been explored to that degree in other resources helps to provide that explanation as to why. Like, what does the data have to say? What is the research?
Yeah.
What is the reason?
Yeah.
It's not just the vegetarian or vegan diet is low in B12. Like we're past that. Like it's more than that, right?
Right.
And so
and that's my frustration with most of the conventional resources on vegetarian or vegan diets as a whole, is they come from the assumption that our guidelines as a whole are accurate. So when we're talking about it containing enough protein, they just are talking about it containing 0.8 grams per kilograms of protein per day. I mean, the RDA for women is set at 45 grams of protein per day. If this is our benchmark for protein adequacy, which we go into in the book in detail why that's not enough for like anybody, but on top of that, like this answers the other question. Research that was new to me, that was surprising. I didn't know this about our dietary guidelines, but our protein recommendations, the RDA assumes for vegetarians that at least half of their protein is coming in from animal sources, meaning eggs or dairy products. So they don't set a separate RDA for vegetarians under the assumption that half of their protein is high quality, has all the amino acids in balance because they're getting it from dairy and eggs. And
that's so interesting. You said that on one of our combined interviews, and I had never heard that before.
Yeah, it's in chapter 5. You probably just forgot.
I'm sure I read it.
Yeah. But there's new data that was looking into that, suggesting that, actually vegetarians should probably be consuming at least 20% more than omnivores due to lower protein quality and imbalance of amino acids and like inability to digest, like those proteins and amino acids are not as bioavailable to them. And that was new data for me. I had never I had never seen that before. So then you combine that with the data we already have showing the RDA for protein is set too low. I mean, arguably probably like 50% too low. And where are we at? Do vegetarians need like 70% more protein? Then how are you going to pull that off with, you can't pull that off with whole foods. You can't, because protein is not highly concentrated in, at least in vegan sources. You could do it through eggs and high protein dairy products. But in vegan sources, all of your plant sources of protein in whole foods come with a heck of a lot of carbohydrates. So you'd have to consume mass calories and mass carbohydrates to make your protein levels go up, unless you're doing protein supplements. So it's like, okay, so are we going to accomplish this with protein supplementation? Then what do we do about the amino acid balance? Because hey, now we have all this data that these so-called non-essential amino acids are actually required for fertility, for ovulatory function, for sperm quality, for egg quality. It opens up a whole lot of questions that nobody has ever explored before. This is not discussed in any of those resources. It's always glossed over because the assumption is that the RDA is accurate. The assumption is that non-essential amino acids are truly non-essential. It's not true. And so then we're left with just a hot mess. I hope this chapter really does end up clearing up some confusion, because yeah, it was fascinating to research and write.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one last thing to say about the chapter is that, like you said at the outset, we're not here to tell somebody do this or do that, just to present the data. And in that vein, you present the path to optimizing. So for anybody for whom this diet is non-negotiable, you present the tools to optimize that. So if animal protein is kind of off the table, well, we're showing you the data, but we're also showing you the best way to incorporate that. And I think the main takeaway is that we wouldn't recommend a vegan diet. It's just not something that is optimal for fertility whatsoever. You can, if you incorporate many of our suggestions to then optimize a vegetarian diet, if that's where you're at, you'll be a lot more informed about how to do that in the best possible way. And then you will have to face some of those questions about those holes and gaps. But why should this information not be provided? It's the same kind of question that we get, like that I am often like if I'm criticized about like talking about the pill, it's like, sometimes they'll be like, it's so negative. Like she's talking about all this stuff, she's trying to dissuade people to come on. Like, no, I'm not. But like, if you're taking something or doing something, shouldn't you be privy to what it really does to the body? Shouldn't we be allowed to have the information, and then you can make that informed choice? So hopefully this chapter also just gives you the basis to make that informed decision.
Yeah. And likewise, like your sections on hormonal birth control and the nutrients that can be depleted from it, and just how there's a delay in the return of your cycle and the return of normal ovulation and the return of like egg quality parameters, ovarian reserve parameters. That is something that's not common knowledge. And sometimes this information is uncomfortable. And I think we were really careful with our language around things, where even if we're stating uncomfortable facts, we're trying to do it from a place of empowerment.
Yeah.
I think that comes across based on all the advanced reviews we've had, which have been overwhelmingly positive. I do think that comes across like we did really make an effort, but there will inevitably, I mean, particularly because fertility is such a triggering topic and such a sensitive topic, there will be people triggered, and we know this. And yet we really made an effort to be as informative and non-triggering as possible while still stating the facts about things.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, yeah, if anyone who's listening can tell, like we labored over this. It's definitely a labor of love. Our contribution to the fertility discussion. We're both very pleased with how it came out. I can't express how excited we both are to finally be able to share this with the world, and we just can't wait to see what impact that it has. We feel I'm speaking for us here, so jump in if
I'm
you're like,
all on
no.
board. Keep going.
But we feel that this is necessary. Like this is where we're at, and we didn't talk a lot about how this infertility issue is growing, how it's becoming more of a problem, how more and more people are struggling to conceive. And still to this day, I mean, I've I first entered this field of fertility awareness over 20 years ago. And yes, the world is different now, and a lot more women know about fertility awareness and cycle charting, but the average woman still is the same as she was 20
Yeah.
years ago. Like we've made a lot of progress in many ways, but it's definitely not mainstream. And I don't know how long it's going to take for us to get there. So with that said, we should
And
probably
then we
wrap
have
this.
to add one more thing, though, is
Okay.
that so many of the existing resources on fertility don't talk about the men at all.
Yes, that too. That's been a
And
huge piece of the feedback that we've had
yeah,
from our advanced reviewers.
so, if 50%, correct my stats if I'm wrong, but I think it's 50% of infertility cases that couples face have a male factor involvement. And then you have all these resources that are only talking about
Women.
egg quality and the
Yeah.
menstrual cycle. That doesn't
Or
fix
glossing over the men.
exactly, totally
Yeah.
glossing over it. So then it's like all the woman's problem. Like that's messed up. You really have to advocate for yourself in healthcare settings to even get freaking sperm quality analysis. Like it's
I've had
ridiculous.
clients who like the clinicians just tell them no. So to share, because it's huge. I mean, honestly, Lily, we could like
I know
we'll
we can
just
keep going.
but you know what though? I think that our listeners are really gonna enjoy this. So I feel like we should just go there. But like to go into it a little bit, what I'd like to share about, why I'm so obsessed with putting the men on blast, essentially, is that I first discovered fertility awareness when I was still a teenager. And so I was very much avoiding pregnancy. And for my entire 20s until I was married and my husband and I decided to start for a baby, I was very much, using this method to avoid pregnancy, avoiding unprotected sex in that window, like the plague, like you stood over there type of situation. And from my personal experience, I mean, when my husband and I tried for our first baby, it was a very interesting. I never got to the point where I was nervous, but we did a try. I got pregnant on my fourth cycle. So I didn't get to the point that I was actually nervous, but I remember being like fascinated. Like, this is so weird because we're having sex in the window and like it didn't happen the first time. And I wasn't like, I don't know why I wasn't nervous because I wasn't, but I just remember being like, wow, this is so weird. And then I conceived and miscarried, and then I conceived in the following cycle, and that was our first baby. And I'm not trying to gloss over that part, but I'm just trying to get through what I'm trying to say here. With my second and then my baby, who's 18 months old, literally one cycle. And I'm not saying this to brag, I'm saying this to share that I have lived in this world where, like, I am just, it's brought to my attention that if I were to have unprotected sex at that window, like it results in a baby. So you can imagine my surprise when I start working with clients and I'm seeing it. We're looking at the chart. They're timing sex correctly. They're having sex at the correct time, cycle after cycle after cycle, and it's not happening.
And you're confirming ovulation is actually happening. You can see it in their cycle parameters.
Yeah, I can see when they have their cervical mucus. I can see when the sex is happening because one of the things that I teach my practitioners and what I do with clients is we confirm, are you noting all of the acts of intercourse on the chart? It's part of the whole way to examine that we're following, the method correctly and the correct timing and everything. So obviously then when you're seeing that, especially coming from my own experience of using it primarily for birth control initially, you have to start asking, why is this not happening? And so it quickly came to my attention that we need to be looking at the men. And from a statistical standpoint, when we get into the sperm chapter, so much data went in there because this is an area that, like you said, women often have even a difficult time advocating to get their partner tested. So we really need to back it up with the data. But when we're looking at, just to throw out a stat, if we are looking at couples who have been trying to conceive for a year or more without success, who've been timing sex relatively correctly, from a statistical standpoint, the partner sperm is not optimal.
Yeah.
It may meet the World Health Organization basic parameters, but it does not. Statistically, he's far more likely to hit those optimal. And I think that this is a huge part of that fertility conversation that is not coming to light. All these men are being told that they're fine because they meet the World Health Organization sperm parameters, but that is not optimal for natural conception. And none of our audience listeners are looking at just fine for their
Right.
family building goals. They want it to be optimal. We want to have optimal health, optimal fertility, healthy babies. And also we want to be healthy as mothers. Motherhood is hard when you're nourished. So imagine how difficult it is when you're not. So, I mean, I could go on, I could stand on the
Yeah.
soapbox
So
until.
there's like just why this sperm quality chapter is so awesome. There's like tables in it showing like where the World Health Organization sperm parameters are, semen analysis parameters are, and how they're just so low. And then we also, I believe there's also a table showing from studies looking at natural conception, the sperm quality
Optimal.
parameters that are actually optimal. So you can actually, if you are able to convince your provider to do an analysis, you can see what the values are and actually compare them. You always want to ask for your full lab test results.
Yeah.
I'm always talking about that for other reasons, but for this as well. And then you have a game plan. You can be like, okay, well, this is not optimal. Okay, these are all the nutrients that are going to optimize semen quality. And ironically, it's a lot of the same stuff that optimizes egg quality and optimizes ovulation. You don't have to do two separate plans for different partners. There might be a handful of things you might choose to selectively supplement or focus on, but there's really a lot of overlap, right?
Yeah.
So it just, I don't know, I think it puts you more in the driver's seat of this whole conversation instead of feeling like totally stuck, completely out of luck, or your only option is to do ridiculously expensive fertility treatments. Even if those end up being needed, because those are sometimes needed, you can improve your chances that they'll be successful. So you don't have to do as many cycles to actually achieve pregnancy. And then I have to throw in one other thing because this is crazy, but like semen quality, that can impact the outcome of your pregnancy as well, because sperm DNA, the male DNA, is more expressed in placental tissue than maternal DNA because it's formed from the embryonic tissue. And there's actually data suggesting that certain pregnancy complications, like preeclampsia, for example, actually have like a male factor component. So if we can like optimize the man, we might, beyond just the conversation of like, let's get you pregnant as soon as possible, let's get you like pregnant with a healthy, viable pregnancy with like less complications sooner. You know what I mean? Like
Exactly.
we have to take it beyond, build your nutrient stores ahead of time, optimize all the things before pregnancy. Easier pregnancy follows, and then you're less depleted postpartum. You know what I mean? Like it's like the full life cycle. I feel like we paint that picture really well in the book, but in case we haven't mentioned that, I wanted to mention that too.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I'm glad that you did because I've been blasting the men for so long that it doesn't always come to mind that I should put it at the forefront. But you're absolutely right. And it's been really interesting to see how many of our advanced readers have commented on the sperm. I was asking questions like, did anything surprise you and that kind of thing. And it was like, I had no idea the impact, like the male factor and that kind of thing. And this is the whole point. We need to, there's no man alive that's so healthy that he can't benefit from improving his diet or male targeted supplementation. So absolutely not. Men, you've been put on notice.
You're on blast.
All right. I mean, I think at this stage, maybe Lily, why don't you share? Because the website has been your baby, really.
Oh,
We took
yeah.
the lead on different tasks in order to get this mammoth project done. And so I know that you were definitely taking the lead on the website. So share with us where the listeners can go to grab the book and to get the download that we were talking about with the citations. And of course, for those of you who'd love to read the first chapter for free, maybe share all the things.
Yeah, so realfoodforfertility.com, very simple. It's just the title of the book. For is written out, FOR, not the number 4. Check it out. That has all the links to where to buy the book. As we launch, paperback and Kindle or ebook are available. There's a little tab there to download the reference list. So download that reference list PDF if you're not quite sure you want to buy yet, or you want preview of the book before you start reading. Download the first chapter for free. That actually has the forward, introduction, and the first chapter because, why not? It has a whole lead up. And there's there's a couple links in the book that'll take you back to the website for a few other resources, but definitely go there. That's the best way to find the book, or just search Amazon, Real Food for Fertility. It should show up, and we hope that it's received well and ranks well. If you love it, that people always ask me like, oh, how can I help spread the word on the book? The number one way to help a book like succeed and to help other people find it is to leave a review. Ideally, leaving a verified review, which means you've purchased a copy. So leaving a verified review tells like the Amazon algorithm, which is like, 95% of books are sold on Amazon. Like that is really the most helpful place to buy a book, as much as everybody wants to rag on Amazon. And like, believe me, I've had my issues with Amazon. Many of my listeners know it still is the number one place to buy a book and leave a review. That's where most people are searching for and buying books. So if you love it, please leave a review. Honest review. We're open to bad reviews too, but like any review really helps the book succeed and reach more people. So that would be our biggest ask if you decide to purchase and like it.
Yeah, for sure. And if you think about how you buy anything, I spend an unfortunate amount of time on Amazon. I know that just upsets some of the listeners. I know a lot of people really go, and I appreciate and respect it, go out of their way to not support Amazon. But when you think about any type of online shopping that you're doing these days, what do? We go to the reviews first and we see what other people thought about it. So definitely, I second that. Yeah, I mean, Lily, we've shared how good friends we are and how we've been talking weekly for many years. So we could do like an afternoon. We could do an afternoon with Lisa and Lily.
Yes, I know. Seriously, we totally could, and people would probably love that and ask us anything.
But I hope that the listeners have enjoyed this. I mean, it was so fun just to chat about it. It was actually really nice. We're at such a good place in our publishing calendar to be able to kind of go back and talk about some of our research finds and kind of revisit when we first had this concept. And it really takes a lot of dedication and effort and work to get it out. And I mean,
and a lot of sacrifice.
I'm proud of us.
No, I'm proud of us too. I had multiple moves. You had a baby. We both launched practitioner training programs in the midst of this. I mean, we've had a lot going on, and this book has always been really taking priority. And even if it's sat aside on the back burner while it's like with an editor or something, it still has always taken priority. And I'm proud of us for finishing it, because it is really hard to bring projects this big to completion. So I just really hope it helps as many people as possible. It's like a $10,000 course in a book, really. The amount of information, it's like wild. So I hope
when I got the proof copy and I saw, you said 30% bigger than Real Food for Pregnancy. Like when you actually see it, it's a lot of, but like we said, everything that's in there has been vetted 100 times. So there's nothing extraneous in there.
Yeah, we were cutthroat on the editing. So it's great.
All right. Well, Lily, thank you so much for being here. This has been so much fun. I'm really excited to share this episode. And, happy launch day. Oh, and we didn't mention that we launched on Valentine's Day. So happy Love Day to everybody. We thought that was your idea as well, which I thought was brilliant. It makes perfect sense. And what a lovely way to complete this project, to release it on Love Day. So
happy Valentine's Day and happy reading.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/508. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode with Lily. I had a great time recording it, and it was really nice to be able to chat and to catch up, and also to share some of the behind the scenes with you. So I know some of you were really curious as to how this came about and our research process and how we were able to, choose who's going to write which sections and all the things. So thank you all for the great questions. For those of you who had responded on social media, it really helped us to kind of, not to say structure our conversation, but it gave us some great questions to ask. I really liked some of the questions that came in. So it was fun to explore some of that and to share with you. So stay tuned for our next episode on Friday. We're going to go into some more details about the content itself of the book. We're going to talk a little bit more about the nutrition aspect of the book and how it relates to fertility and why we chose to take the approach that we did. So lots of great info coming up. So, of course, I hope that you enjoy the rest of your weekend, whenever you're tuning into the show. And until next time, be well and happy charting. And that's a wrap. If you're loving the podcast, I know you'll love our Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program. I am so thrilled at the release of Real Food for Fertility, as this is going to be one of our textbooks for our program, and all of our new members will be getting a copy. FAM is a 9-month immersive experience that will completely transform the way you work with clients, allowing you to not only teach fertility awareness to your clients, but to use the menstrual cycle as a vital sign and diagnostic tool in your women's health practice. Our next class starts on February 27th, so there's still time to reserve your spot. There's no other program like this offered anywhere. Transform your practice in 9 months. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/famlive to apply now. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMLIVE.